Welcome to the Addendum series, where I elaborate on my thoughts about myths, legends, and folklore, often as it pertains to the modern day. So, let's get to the show. Okay, so here's the thing you've got to understand about mythology. It's old, and like many old things, it has a lot of sexism built into it. As I was recording Arthur, I was again and again struck by just how few women there are in these stories, and how much they are expected to be props as opposed to actors with agency. Take Guinevere, for example. She is portrayed as a sort of secondary amplification of Arthur's story beats. She's either with him or against him. She is a plot device to tell the story of Lancelot and Arthur and their conflict. She never exercises real choice of her own. She's treated as though she is expected to just by default be in love with Arthur, because this is a romance story, in part. So you have to really look for the characters that are women, and also allowed by the storytellers to be actors. There's Nimue, who, unfortunately I couldn't get to this as during the actual episode due to length. She gets annoyed with Merlin's continuous advances on her and ends up pumping him for all his magical information, and then locks him in a cave to die. And that is the only time in this story that there was any exercise of agency by the women involved. Arthur's mom is just her only function is to be tricked by Uther. She doesn't ever act of her own desires. She absurdly marries Uther because in this culture women had no power and therefore could not refuse the High King or really the advance of almost any man. Her desires are treated as just a non-issue. The story goes so far as to say that she's pleased to be sleeping with Uther after he murdered her husband, who she may or may not have loved. It never addresses the issue. Women's feelings are just never addressed. Not truly. And I tried to write some of it in as a creative license, but it was very difficult just because of the structure of the tale. That's the prop side of women in mythology. The other side is women are either that or they are a threat. The mystical woman who betrays and murders Merlin. Guinevere, who betrays Arthur and flees with Lancelot. In broader mythology, mystical women being portrayed as a threat to communities. Stories of witches and witchcraft, and the terrible things done to people who lived on the fringes of society. Women who were not attached to a man and therefore viewed in these cultures as freeloaders of a sort, and therefore a problem. It's not like there's no value in these old myths. That's why I'm interested in them, is I think they do have value, and part of their value is showing where we've come from, that the sexist past is not necessarily our future. We can learn from the sexism in these stories not to be sexist, to point out all the ways in which women were treated so poorly in these stories, and put women forward as we go forward as a society. So while I am often disgusted by the rampant sexism in these stories, I try to remember that the past is not the future, that the sexism of our ancestors will not be the inheritance of our children if we actively point out the ways in which these stories are sexist and misogynistic. The sexism in Arthur was egregious enough that it was really the main distraction as I was recording. So those are my thoughts on Arthur, at least part of them. I'm sure I have more. Thanks for listening, and I hope to see you at the next episode.